Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the application seminar for round 12 of the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. I'm Amy Taylor. I'm a marketing executive at Talon, which is the delivery partner for HNES. You might previously have known us as GemServe, as we've recently rebranded. So first of all, I'm going to cover some quick housekeeping rules. Please mute your microphones to limit disruption. And if you're not speaking, then please turn off your webcams to improve video quality. We'll also have a Q&A function. So if you'd like to ask any questions during the webinar, pop your questions in there and we'll try to answer the questions through the session. But we also have a dedicated Q&A section at the end. This webinar is being recorded and we will be distributing the slides afterwards. I'll just quickly run through the agenda. So Louise is going to start us off talking through the introduction to HNES and examples of funded projects. We'll then pass over to Rasheen, who will be discussing optimization studies and the application process. We'll then pass back to Louise, who will just talk about submitting an application and the assessment process. And then Abby will discuss the support available for applicants. We'll then host our Q&A section where the team are going to be on hand to answer any questions that you may have. So without further ado, I will hand over to Louise.
Thank you very much, Amy. Hi, everyone. So I'm Louise Singleton. I'm the Programme Manager for HNES at Talon. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to what HNES is. So we have three objectives within the scheme. The first is to reduce carbon emissions by making heat networks more efficient. So obviously what we're looking at is improving the operation and the efficiency of your heat networks, hopefully meaning that you need to use less energy or fuel to come into the heat network, and therefore reducing the number of carbon emissions that are being emitted by the network. The second one is about reducing customer detriment to improve consumer confidence. Now, this is a really key one. It's something that the government is really keen to support, particularly in light of rising energy costs. And so there's kind of two parts to this. The first is reducing customer detriment. So that's actually looking at the types of customers that you have on your network, which I'll touch on a bit on the next slide, and making sure that we're really supporting those that are less able to pay for their fuel, and then they're not being penalised excessively for the fact that their heat network isn't efficient. And the second part is around improving consumer confidence. So the government has targets that they want to meet to increase the number of heat networks in the country, and they want to make sure that those that are on heat networks already are having a good experience. Oh, sorry, can someone mute themselves? There's some background. Thank you very much. Yeah, so they want to make sure that those that are on existing heat networks are having a good experience, meaning that in the future, when new heat networks are being built, people are keen to have heat network themselves. And finally, the third one is around preparing the heat network market for sector regulation and technical standards. So hopefully you're aware of things like the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme that is coming in the next year or so. And so the aim of that is to set standards for the performance of both new and existing heat networks, and so HNES is there to be able to support existing heat networks to improve their efficiency so that they can hopefully align with the requirements that will be set out under the HNTAS scheme. So if I go on to the next slide, so for those of you that are already familiar with the scheme, there is a significant change that's happened for round 12, which is to do with capital applications and the eligibility criteria around customers in need. So we have a guidance for applicants document. There's a link at the bottom here, and we can put a link to it in the chat as well. We issued our new version on the 7th of April to coincide with round 12 opening. You can see at the end of the document, pages 72 and 73, a list of all the changes that have been made to that version from the previous version. So I've listed out most of them here, but the key one I wanted to touch on is this eligibility criteria. So from round 12, if you are applying for capital funding, you must have, your heat network must supply heat to customers in need. And we define customers in need in our guidance. And essentially it is customers that are have in sort of financial vulnerabilities. So I will just quickly find the definition, which I should probably have got up for now. So we define customers in need as dwellings that supply heat and energy by a heat network in which a resident or residents are considered financially vulnerable and will therefore benefit significantly from reduced costs for heating. This includes any of the following categories: social housing, low-income housing, customers in fuel poverty, extra care housing, low-income care homes and supported housing. It doesn't include affordable home ownership, shared ownership, elderly residents or those over 55 unless they require additional care, or students. So that's set out in our guidance. So again, have a look at that if you want that in more detail. But essentially, if you do not supply heat to customers in need, you are not able to apply for capital funding unless you can demonstrate that the heat network has a strategic rationale for receiving the funding. And that strategic rationale is to government, not necessarily to yourselves. So an example, or a couple of examples might be that there is a link to the expansion of another heat network that's being funded through the Green Heat Network Fund, or if your heat network is expected to connect to a heat network within a heat network zone. So obviously these two, so the GHNF and zoning are key government policies to grow heat networks in the UK. So they want to make sure that if there are heat networks that will be interacting with these other policies and they need improvement in order to do that, that there is still funding available for that. So so that is the kind of exception to the rule, I guess. If you can demonstrate that you do have this strategic rationale, then you can apply for capital funding, but only in those instances. It's worth noting that for revenue applications, if you don't have customers in need, then you are still able to apply. But again, it's worth noting that we do, we'll talk about this later on in the webinar, but we do look at the number of customers in need as well, and we do prioritise those with higher numbers of customers in need. But you're not excluded from applying for revenue funding. This just applies to capital funding. So that's quite a significant change from previous rounds for any of you that have been involved in the scheme before. Other changes include, again, for capital funding, we've included an additional supporting evidence document. So we have a cost spreadsheet that we'd like you to complete alongside your application form, just to make it clearer for our cost consultants how your supporting evidence, so your quotes, where you've got your funding amounts from, how they then match up with your application form, because we spend a lot of time in previous rounds. Essentially, the first round of clarifications tends to just be, please can you explain how your costs align with your application form? So which is a bit of a waste of a clarification round. So we've provided this supplementary cost spreadsheet, which hopefully gives that clarity from the outset, and it means that we can ask more sort of specific questions about your application and get more out of those clarification rounds. We've added some additional funding rounds, so round 14 is now mentioned in the guidance. We've changed, obviously, all of the mentions from GemServe to Talan, and our email sort of contact details and everything like that have been updated. We were successful in receiving additional funding through the Warm Homes Plan in January, so there is now funding for the scheme out to 2030, so that's been reflected in the guidance as well. And again, just some more references to relevant legislation you might want to include. So So yeah, please have a look at the guidance. Like I say, there have been some significant updates. So even if you think you're familiar with it, it is worth having a read over and making sure you're clear on what the eligibility criteria is now. We go to the next slide. So in terms of funding, we have two funding pots. We have revenue and capital grants. So revenue funding is for paying an external third party to come in and undertake an optimization study. So what that means is looking at how your heat network is performing currently and making recommendations as to the sort of measures that could be installed to improve the efficiency of the network. So these can be fully funded between a range of £15,000 to £24,000, including VAT. Within round 12, you'll be able to apply for funding for the financial year 26, 27 and 27, 28. So you can apply for all in one year or the other, or you can split it across the two financial years. For capital funding, it's part funded, so we can fund up to but not including 50% of all of your eligible measures. And for round 12, you'll be able to apply for funding in 3 financial years, so 26, 27, 27, 28 and 28, 29 now. So as I said, we received additional funding through the Warm Homes Plan, so an additional £30 million has been awarded for 28, 29 and 29, 30. So that's really positive news, and it shows that the government is continuing to support HNES and sees the value in the scheme moving forward. So that's good to hear. When you receive grant funding, you must spend it in the financial year that it's allocated to. So it's really important when you're completing your application form to think about your project plan and your timeframes for delivering, and make sure that you are realistic in assigning the funding to the relevant financial years, because we'll need you to be able to evidence that you've spent the funding and draw down that funding in the financial year that you've requested it in. But it's worth noting for capital grants, you don't need to spend your match funding at the same time as your grant funding. So if you want to, you could front load your grant funding, for example, and then use your match funding later on in the project, or vice versa, depending on your budgets. But you don't need to go along at the same intervention rate for the two at once. So it's like I say, it's really important from a DESNZ perspective. Obviously, they have their budgets allocated to them, and if we allocate funding to you in a particular financial year, that needs to be spent in that year, otherwise it's lost and it can't then be awarded to someone else. So please really think about the financial years that you're applying for funding for. Okay, next slide. So again, there's a lot more detail about this in the guidance document, but for capital grants, we're able to fund works from the energy centre all the way through to elements within the dwellings and some elements of metering as well. But it's probably easier to talk through what's ineligible. So you're not able to apply for any funding for works that have already been incurred before you receive your HNES award letter. So once we've gone through all the assessments process, we will send you a letter that confirms whether or not you've been successful. From the time you receive that funding or that letter, that's when you can start doing your work, basically. Although it's worth noting that there will be a funding agreement document that you need to sign, and obviously so there's a bit of a risk between receiving your award letter and signing that document. If for whatever reason that document doesn't get signed and you don't receive the funding, you may have incurred costs that you can't then recover. But essentially any work prior to that funding award letter is not eligible. Anything that's not related to the heat network infrastructure, so anything to do with building fabric improvements, for example, wouldn't be included. Anything to do with engagement activities, so stakeholder management, internal project management, essentially if you already employ someone to do this work, we can't then cover their costs because they're essentially already employed. If you're employing someone specifically, so for example, an external project manager, because the project's just too big and you don't have the internal resources to do it, that is a specific cost for this specific project, and therefore that could be included. Looking at sort of specific elements of the heat network as well. So within the energy centre, we're not able to cover costs for replacing primary heat generation source. So the heat network efficiency scheme is all designed about looking at improving the efficiency. There is a sort of hierarchy of where you're meant to sort of focus your attention when you're looking at efficiencies, and essentially sort of working from the dwellings backwards is probably the sort of preferred route. So if you've got a really inefficient heat network, simply replacing the boiler isn't going to help. So we want to make sure we're actually improving the efficiency of the network rather than necessarily just replacing boilers. We also can't cover fuel costs for temporary energy supply. So if you do need to take the generation, the energy supply offline throughout your project for whatever reason, we can cover temporary boilers. So the hire of temporary boilers, but we can't cover the fuel costs for running those boilers. Within the tertiary networks, we can't cover things like replacing or buying pipework and heat emitters. We can cover things like installing TRVs and controls within dwellings, but not actually replacing the radiators or underfloor heating themselves. And finally, any metering that you would have been eligible or you would have been required to install under the metering and billing regulations, then you are not able to claim for that because you should legally be required to install those yourselves anyway. Yeah, if it's going above and beyond the metering and billing regs, we can cover some elements of metering, but if you have a legal requirement to install those, then we can't cover it under HNES. If you go to the next slide. So for revenue grants within our guidance document, we set out what we a sort of scope of works for what we would expect to see from an optimization study. So that's what's eligible for the funding. What's ineligible is any work that's already been commissioned or occurred. Again, same as with the capital application. Any internal staffing, so any, again, project management of your consultant, for example, that wouldn't be eligible. And anything to do with construction, operation or maintenance of the heat network. So that's not to do with the revenue study, that is more potentially capital or actual like running of the heat network, that wouldn't be covered either. So in terms of who can apply, so taking obviously this with the caveat of what I said at the beginning for capital projects, but what we're looking at is you need to be an operator or an owner or an operator of an existing district heating or communal heating system. So the key thing is it has to be existing, it has to be operational, but we can cover district or communal heating systems. The heat network must be in England or Wales. And essentially who can apply is public sector, private sector, third sector organisations. So again, with the capital caveat of having customers in need, and with the revenue, obviously you can apply if you don't have customers in need for revenue funding. But the key point is that the applicant organisation must be a legal entity, and they must have the authority to sign off on investment decisions for the heat network. So that could be the owner, that could be the operator. It depends on the setup of the heat network. It could be the leaseholders, it could be the managing agent. It really depends on the individual heat network. But essentially, we want to make sure that whoever is receiving the funding, from a revenue perspective, obviously there's no match funding necessarily, but the idea is that you're getting a document that will give you some recommendations about how to improve your network. Ideally, we would want the person that might be making investment decisions to implement those measures has visibility and is supportive of the fact that this optimization study is being undertaken. And obviously on the capital side, there is this match funding portion. So whoever's responsible for the match funding, we want to make sure that they have visibility and are aware that this application is being made in their organization's name, essentially. So it's kind of for you guys to decide who that organization is, but essentially a consultant, for example, can't submit a revenue application on behalf of a client. It needs to be the client that's the applicant. Similarly, if you are a managing agent, but you might hold the bank account, for example, for the resident association, for example, that's your client, but ultimately you don't make investment decisions. Therefore, the resident association would need to be the applicant, and then you could sort of manage the application on their behalf, but that would need to be the organisation that receives the funding. So we ask you to submit what we call an AP1A form, and that's your bank details. Basically, it's where will the grant funding go. So ideally, the name of the applicant will be the same name as the bank account that the funding goes into. If again in the managing agent route, it can be the managing agent's bank account details if that's what's held for the organisation, but we would need the directors of the housing association, the resident association, to confirm and to submit that AP1A form and confirm that those are the bank details that they want the funding to be paid into, because ultimately it's their application and it's for them to determine where the funding goes to. If you go to the next slide. So in terms of funding rounds then, so obviously this is for round 12. So the funding round is open and the deadline for submissions is the 22nd of May. If you want to submit an application, you need to contact us by no later than the 8th of May to request an application form. Anything after that date, you won't be able to apply if you haven't already requested a space. We then obviously have round 13 and now round 14 as well. So round 13, we're looking at closing on the 9th of October, and then round 14 will be in February 2027. Again, subject to budget availability, but we expect that those rounds will run. So if this round is too early for you, then there are future rounds coming down the line as well. Okay, so just quickly, just to touch on a couple of funded projects, just to give you an idea of what we've funded in the past. So we've publicly announced rounds 1 to 9, and so within those 9 funding rounds, we've funded almost 400 projects and awarded over £65 million of capital and revenue funding, with around 70,000 residents benefiting. So yeah, it's been a popular scheme, and yeah, we've got some good amounts of money out the door to suitable projects. We've got majority of applications are from housing associations, but we have funded private sector organisations as well. And yeah, you can see the range of different organisations there as well. If you go to the next slide, so we've got a good spread of applications around England and Wales. So yeah, I think all regions have had projects submitted and been successful. In terms of capital works, sort of some of the things that we've funded, so upgrading or replacing pipe work, improving insulation, so whether that's installing insulation where there's been no installation before, or sort of upping the thickness of the insulation so that it meets like relevant standards. Updating controls, so that could be in the plant room, or like I say, it could be within the dwellings themselves. Replacing or recommissioning HIU, so heat interface units within dwellings, is quite a common application. And then looking at things like water quality and reducing leaks, also things like closing bypasses, so making sure that and sort of improving the delta T between flow and return temperatures. Those kind of measures are the sort of things that we're looking for. And then just to give you some highlights of round 9, what we funded. So we awarded over £8 million to 69 heat networks. Just a couple of examples. So in the top left picture, you've got the University of Chichester, who received funding for a revenue study. The top right is a network in the London Borough of Islington. Bottom left is for Connect Housing Association. And on the right, we've got Stockport Metropolitan Borough Council, who received capital funding in round 9. There's a link at the bottom there. Again, the slides will be shared afterwards. which takes you to our press release, and that gives you a list of all the projects that were funded and some detail about what they received funding for. All round press releases are on our website, so you can have a look back over previous rounds as well and see the sort of types of projects that were funded. So that might be of interest to people. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Roisin now to talk to you about the optimization studies in more detail.
Thanks, Louise. Hi, everyone. My name is Roisin. So I'm going to start by talking about the optimization studies, which relate to the revenue projects. So when it comes to submitting the optimization report, we look for it to be broken down into 3 parts. The first being work package 1, which has the aim to investigate the current operational performance and identify the condition of the network. In work package 1, we're looking to develop a baseline against which optimization measures can be utilized, and then the impact they will have if carried out, which is quantified in work package 2. Demonstrating these in the report is important so the heat network operator understands the causes of suboptimal performance and that the heat network is experiencing and the impact these causes have on the operation of the network and its customers. The steps for this then include at least 1 project site visit by the supplier, where we'll need photos, diagrams, and descriptions of the heat network. Then, based on the work carried out at the site visit, suppliers will propose and quantify metrics, targets, and KPIs for measuring operational performance for the baseline data. The baselining must cover the assessment of the whole network architecture, including plant room, energy center, primary, secondary, tertiary network, and the customer interfaces. And the KPIs are important as they form the basis for considering the benefits and the cost effectiveness of recommendations proposed in work package 2. Next slide, please. So work package 2 is about the heat network optimization opportunities. The aim is to identify potential optimization measures and quantify the costs and impacts that implementing these would have on network performance. So in this section, the heat network operator will receive a robust analysis of the recommendations and a clear course of action to improve the operational performance and customer outcomes. This is to provide a better overall understanding of the heat network, including any issues being faced and the quality and relevance of the data being received. So ultimately, this analysis will enable the consultant to identify and develop individual measures or packages of measures. So, for example, an individual measure could be upgrading pipe work, or determine where these measures can be combined to achieve greater impact. So all such measures will be delivered in work package 2. The steps then are firstly the development of the optimization measures and assembling them into the packages of measures. So as stated before, it's important to understand which measures work most effectively together and where budget constraints apply to determine which options deliver the greatest efficiency improvements using the most cost-effective approach. Within this then, reporting and recommendations should be included. We also asked to see the baseline data and the optimized situation results in a table to clearly reflect where the measures have created the improvements. So for example, reduction in carbon emissions, heat losses, etc. So this is for the measures you gathered baseline data for previously. Essentially, we want to be able to compare the data to see if X measure is installed, what will be the benefit of this, and we want to quantify it. And just a point as well, so all the details for what is expected in the report and TA is in the HNES guidance for applicants document, which we spoke about earlier, and it can be found online. You should use Annex A as a sort of checklist to help you guide through this. And we do understand that not all the measures listed will be relevant to each heat network, but please do try to report against as many as you can and include figures, even if they're just estimates in the table. Next slide, please. So for the final deliverables, first of all, will be the project report, which includes the work package 1, work package 2, and the techno-economic analysis results. The the techno-economic analysis spreadsheet as well, which must be provided as an unlocked Excel file format. And there should be a breakdown of costs for each measure, as well as total costs, including any contingency and prelims. It's very important that the file is allowed to be editable by the heat network owner. So if they need to adjust anything like costs, which can be discussed with the consultant. The next part, once the optimization report and the TA have been provided and reviewed by us, we'll need the final submission of the revenue M&R worksheet, which includes the optimization study outputs. So once we've received all of the above and it's been successfully signed off, we also advise to continue on with a capital grant application for the next round. So next, I'm going to be talking about the application process. Next slide, please. So yeah, I'm going to run through the sections of the application form so that you're aware of what information is required. So in section A, this is where you'll provide the applicant organisation information and parent company information if relevant, as well as contacts relating to the application. So these will need to be the primary contact of the heat network and a secondary contact. These will be the contacts that we reach out to throughout the application and assessment process. It's also important to ensure that the applicant name matches the legal entity exactly, so what is listed on Companies House. The VAT number should also be included if the company is VAT registered. If it's not, then please do put NA in the application form. It's just important for our checks that all the fields are completed. So for section B then, project information. This is where we ask about the network itself, such as the address of the energy centre. The key part here is customers in need percentage and how that figure's been derived. For capital projects, if the percentage is 0, then you cannot apply unless you have evidence that your heat network would be deemed strategic by the government. For example, through links to GHNF, so Green Heat Network Fund, or if it is expected to connect to a heat network in a heat network zone. In this section, we also ask questions about your contractors and whether you have complied with regulatory requirements, such as registering the heat network with the Energy Ombudsman. Section C is the project narrative. So we're looking for an overview of the project and what the funding will deliver. We would like to see network data availability, quality and metering. So this section is a chance to tell us all about the project, and we ask that you're as detailed as possible. We also look for a rationale of how your application applies our objectives, which are set out in the guidance and was on the first slide. There's also the approach to disseminating information. So we'd like to know how you plan to communicate with, for example, if it's a capital application, if you have leaseholders, freeholders permission. And if it's a revenue application, during the site visit, we'll need access to the tertiary part of the network. So it's important for the residents to be aware of this. So we need this communication as well. Next slide, please. So for section D, this is about the baseline and target information. Please enter as much data as you can, particularly if it's a measure you want to improve on. If you don't know these figures, you can calculate them, but again, we'll need a methodology on how you calculated the numbers. For capital projects as well, on the online portal, there are mandatory cells that must be completed before you can proceed. But for revenue projects, we just need the baseline data. We know that for revenue projects, you might not know the information, which is why you're undertaking the optimization study in the first place. But we would like to see as much data provided as you can in the forms. For section E, funding and procurement, for this section, we need the total application budget and the funding request, including funding year splits if applicable. So for revenue funding requests, this can be between £15,000 and £24,000, which is the usual range for optimization studies. If it does go above this, we will ask for strong justification as to why that additional funding is required. Please do also separate the VAT costs from the total project costs, so that is clear and you're aware of how much the project costs and VAT amount to separately, especially if that is irrecoverable and will therefore be awarded in the grant. It's worth noting as well that for capital applications, confirmations as to where match funding is coming from and that it's been secured is also now required. And then also we need procurement information. So any procurement milestones, start and end dates, how long the project is estimated to take, that sort of thing, as well as the use of heat network exchanged, planned use of SMEs, proposed contractors and consultants. And we also need to know the makes and models of new equipment. So section F then, confirmation. So this is just to confirm you provided all supporting evidence required, including confirmation that the named applicant organisation has authority to sign off on investment decisions for the heat network, as well as for capital applications to confirm that the supplementary cost spreadsheet has been uploaded. And it's also just to declare that all the data and information has been provided to the best of your knowledge. Next slide, please. So supporting evidence. So for capital funding, we require evidence of the project costs. So any quotes gathered, which should include all of the measures that plan to be undertaken, and any of the prelims and contingency costs. So this documentation should be provided the same time you submit the initial application, rather than gathering the information later during the assessment process, as this can delay things. We also need the supplementary cost spreadsheet, evidence of targeted benefits, a signed letter confirming that the named applicant has the authority to sign off on investment decisions for the heat network, confirmation that there is applicant support for the application and works to be supported, match funding contribution, acceptance of monitoring and reporting requirements, and lastly, the confirmation of, where relevant, of any subsidies relevant to the project. Also required then is the summary programme of works and a completed AP1A supplier form. So the AP1A constitutes the finance information, and the details on this form will be the bank account the funding is paid into. So it's essential that you inform us as early as possible of any changes to details. Revenue grants, the supporting evidence we'll need is similar. So the evidence of application costs, a signed letter from a person of authority over the network, match funding if relevant, acceptance of monitoring reporting requirements, as this is also required in revenue grants, and confirmation of any other or previous subsidies relevant to the project. You must also provide the AP1A form and any evidence of communication methods where possible. Next slide, please. So applying for multiple projects under HNES, you can actually submit multiple applications in the same funding round. However, on the grounds that for revenue grants, you will be asked to explain how the networks differ and why you cannot use the learnings and knowledge gained from one optimization study to the other heat network. So if they do have significant differences, you can submit multiple applications in these cases, but it does need to be detailed. For capital grants, it's slightly different, but consideration should be given as to whether capital works are similar in nature and whether running projects sequentially rather than in parallel might be more beneficial. So regarding submitting further applications after funding has been awarded in previous funding rounds, applicants should explain how lessons learned from previous studies have been used and why these cannot be applied to new applications. So again, any differences in the heat networks will need to be highlighted. In terms of capital grants and submitting further applications, we ask that any of the lessons learned in the previous projects are incorporated into the new applications where that is applicable. And I just want to address the point at the bottom of the slide as well, where we actively encourage capital applications from heat networks that have previously been awarded revenue funding. So this is where the optimization studies have then directed the implementation of recommended capital measures. Thank you. I'll now pass you on to Louise to discuss submitting an application.
Thanks, Roisin. I've noticed there's been quite a few questions and comments in the chat and the Q&A. If it's possible to use the Q&A rather than the chat, just 'cause it makes it easier to reply to the comments. But hopefully I've replied to most of them. And yeah, we'll keep going through those as we go through. But I now wanted to talk you through how to use the online portal for submitting your applications. So I will, oh, 1 minute, I just need to log back into the portal. 1 minute, it's logged me out. Right, there we go. So now if I share my screen. So for those of you that have used the application portal before, you will be familiar with the screen. So this is where you will see your application forms. If you have applied previously, you can use the same login details as you have already received. And what you'll see is, so for example, if you applied in round 10, you will see your previous applications listed on this dashboard, and then your new application for round 12. If you haven't applied before, we'll need to set you up as a new user on the portal. You will receive an email from noreply at talansm.com with a temporary password. You'll need to log in within 7 days of that temporary password being issued, and then you'll be able to change your password, and you'll then have access to the portal. Please sign in before that temporary password expires, because otherwise we need to basically reissue it, re-add you to all the projects that you've requested, which is okay if you've only got one project, but if you have lots of projects, it takes a lot of time. So please make sure to sign in with it. But we will email you as well to let you know that we've set you up. So you should know if it does go into your junk folder, for example, you should know when to look for it. But yeah, please sign in within those 7 days, because otherwise it's just a bit of a admin annoyance. So you'll log in, you'll see your project here. If you scroll across, you'll see for this project here in round 10, I'm one icon less, and that's basically the edit application button. So for any previous rounds, you can no longer edit your application. Similarly, once round 12 closes, so at midnight, well, 11:59 on the 22nd of May, you will no longer have this button to edit your application and submit it. So if you don't submit it by that deadline, the application window is closed and your application will not be assessed. But you'll be set up. You have 3 buttons here. The first one is to edit the application. The second button is to go to documents. So if I click on that one first, this is where you can upload all your supporting evidence. So your project plan, your cost evidence, if you're submitting a capital application, maybe your optimization study or your evidence for why your funded measures are the right ones. So you can go to upload document here. It's already selected as application category, and then you can choose your file. It's worth noting that we've increased the file size from previous rounds, so the file size is now 50 meg. So hopefully that's helpful for some of the larger documents that we receive. If you do end up submitting an application form and we go through to clarifications, you'll receive your clarification through into here, and to reply, if you have to upload any other documents, you can then select clarifications as your document category, and that just lets us know that they are related to the clarification process, not necessarily the application process. But for your application itself, it's already selected, so that's the first one that appears. So you choose your file and then you upload the document, and then that will appear in this list there. But if I go back to projects, so before you've started doing anything, this document at the end here is essentially a summary of your application. If you haven't done anything yet with your application, it basically just says it's blank. So that's just because there's nothing's been entered yet. But I'll show you once I've gone into the application form what happens once it's been saved. But yeah, so you'll go in here, you'll be able to edit your application. So if you click on that, that takes you to the application form, and then there are various steps to go through for each of the sections. So the first page is just some evidence or some information. The next page, so this is essentially what Roisin has talked through, the different sections. So this is where you fill in the information about your organisation itself. So type of information, your address of the organisation, so who is the applicant organisation that's applying. Contact details, so these are the people that we will contact in relation to your application form, so primary and secondary contacts. So if you have a clarification question, for example, these are the people that will receive, these two will receive the notification that a clarification has been raised. So it's important that you put the relevant people in these sections because that's who will be contacted about the application. I won't go through every single page, but down here then you've got the section around customers in need. So you can put in here the percentage of customers in need that you have, and then this is the box where you can explain how you've arrived at that percentage. So you can provide us with sort of written explanation as to your number, and then this new question here around, is your network of strategic importance to the government's ambitions to grow heat networks in the UK? And then if you click yes, we then ask you to explain why that is and the evidence that you have for that. So that's the new kind of section for round 12 for this this particular project. What else was going to say? So there are certain sections or questions that have red asterisks next to them. These will need to be completed before you submit the application at the end, but you are able to move between the different pages of the form without having completed these sections. It's just at the end, so you can go through and you can see all the information that you need to and all the questions that you need to answer before you actually have to submit everything. So it's not stopping you from moving forward, but you will need to have completed all the ones with the asterisks before you submit your application. I think that was the main parts that I wanted to show you on here. And then, so if, for example, what I was going to show you was if I just put in Talon UK and just say a private company, if I save progress, if I then go back to my projects and I click on this icon now you can see the information about all, so you can see now these are all the different questions that will be asked, and you can see who's completed, like what's been submitted for each answer. So you now get your summary of your application from the first time that you've saved something. So that's it really. If I go back to the slides, Amy. There we go, fab, thank you. So key things to remember if you go to the next slide when using the system. Save as you go along. It doesn't automatically save if you move to the next page, so there's a save button at the top. So just make sure you're saving regularly as you go through. Only one person can edit the form at a time, so but multiple people can view. So you can click on that summary page, multiple people can be on that page, but in terms of editing, only one person can edit, and it will pop up and tell you that it's locked by another user. It basically just means that people can't overwrite other people's entries, and it makes it easier from that perspective. So yeah, you will be told if someone else is in the system and who that person is. So if you do need to get in, you can contact them to ask them to leave so you can go in and work on it. But yeah, it just means that people can't overwrite other work. and it's important to make sure that you upload all your supporting documents before you press submit on your application form. So once you press submit, it basically locks the application form. You can't then go back in and make any changes. So that's the final act that you should take when you're doing your application form. It just means that we know that nothing has changed from when it's been submitted. So when we're doing our assessments, for example, we know that we're assessing the latest version and that people haven't been going in and changing it while we've been assessing it. So please make sure that you upload all your supporting documents and you finish all of that section first before you press submit on your application form, because it will lock the system and you won't be able to make any changes or upload any more documents once it's been submitted. So that's a key thing to remember. Okay, so if you do want to apply, we ask you to email hnes@talan.com to let us know that you want to apply. We will then ask you a number of questions about your network. So, well, for example, what type of application do you want? Do you want capital or revenue? How much funding are you looking to apply for? What's your percentage of customers in need? Who do you want to have access to the portal for that particular application? So a number of different questions. And then if we're happy that you are eligible, we will then set you up with an application form on the portal. As I've said, new users will get an email with the temporary link. Previous users can log in using your existing credentials. Once we've set you up on the system, we'll send you a separate email from hnes@talan.com with your application pack and confirmation that your space has been set up. So if you until you receive that email, you won't have had your project set up. So if you are an existing user, just because you've submitted an expression of interest doesn't mean you automatically get a space. So we do need to actually set them up ourselves. So it's only after you receive that email with your application pack that you should then see your new project in the dashboard. And as I said before, the last date to request an application space is the 8th of May. That basically means that you have enough time to complete your application form. If it was any closer to that, you've obviously got to go in and actually complete all the information. So we want to make sure we're getting good quality applications through. Okay, so moving on to the assessment process then. So obviously you've gone through, you've submitted your application, it comes through to our team for assessment. And we look at a number of different scoring criteria. So I'm going to talk through the capital applications first. So there are 5 scoring criteria for capital applications. The first one is deliverability, and that's broken down into 2 sections, one around cost and one around delivery certainty. So cost is basically, you've obviously applied for funding, whatever amount of funding you've applied for. We want to understand how have you arrived at that funding amount, and what's the sort of cost evidence that you have to support that funding. So have you got quotes from the market? Have you got quantity surveyor estimates? We don't specify that you have to have gone out to get 3 quotes, for example. If you've got someone already on a framework or something that you know you definitely want to go to that one supplier, that's fine. But what we want to understand is, what we don't want is someone to come in and request say, I don't know, £100,000, and we then award that funding and we find out that actually they've completely undercooked it, and in reality the project's now £500,000 and they don't have the funding to cover the project. Or similarly the other way around, that the project actually comes in at £50,000 and we've essentially earmarked funding for you that then couldn't have been awarded to someone else, but is then not claimed. So it's really important for us to understand what's the evidence and the rationale for the amount of money that you're requesting. On the delivery certainty, this is around your project plan and your timeframes. So again, it kind of ties to cost as well, and the idea around your funding being allocated to certain financial years. So we're looking here for a realistic project plan. So have you considered all the steps that you might need to undertake? And does the work then align, do the timeframes align with the financial years and the funding amounts that you've requested in those financial years? So if you have, for example, requested all your funding in 26-27, but your project plan is going out to 28, 29, we're going to look at that and go, well, actually, that doesn't seem realistic. You're probably going to need to draw down some funding in 27, 28. So why haven't you asked for that? So we just want to make sure that, like I say, the funding is claimed and is claimed in the financial years that it's been requested at. On network performance improvement, so there are 5 sections here. So what we're looking at really is what is the impact these measures are going to have on the sort of efficiency of your heat network. So understanding what is your baseline current operating level, and where do you expect to get to as a result of the funded works that you're putting in. So that could be a reduced cost to the operator of delivering heat to the end customer. It could be a reduction in the end customer tariff as a result of the works. It could be a reduction in heat losses or an improvement in the efficiency of the network. You could have a significant number of service interruptions, and as a result, this will reduce those interruptions to customers. You could be looking to make gas and electricity savings. A key one on this is to remember is that so we ask for the sort of fuel inputs, and so the baseline fuel inputs and the target fuel inputs. And it's worth considering that there might be electricity savings, even if your network is sort of is predominantly fueled by gas-fired boilers. For example, if you're making improvements to the efficiency of your network, which means that your pumps are operating more efficiently, you might see a reduction in electricity as a result of the operation of the heat network. So the sort of indirect savings, rather than the fact that the network itself is fueled by electricity. So it's worth considering both the direct savings of the fuel being imported to heat the network, and also the indirect savings from electricity specifically for any efficiency improvements that you're making for the network. And then the final part of this one is the quality of supporting information. So we want to understand, if you're saying you're going to reduce your gas consumption by 50%, what's your evidence for that? How have you determined that? So this is where things like a revenue study or an optimization study come in. It doesn't have to be an HNES funded optimization study. You could have a sort of other supporting evidence that essentially shows that someone's done some calculations and based on sort of sound economic, what's the word I'm trying to think of, engineering principles, you can demonstrate that you would expect to see this kind of saving. But what we don't want is someone just to kind of go finger in the air, oh, probably about 50%, because from a government perspective, they are looking at the sort of the benefits of the funding that they're putting in, and the sort of level, the extent of the improvements that are being realised. So we want to make sure that the target figures that are being put into the application are as accurate or as reasonable as possible, and are as achievable as possible, because obviously we want to see the benefits being realised that are put in at the application stage. If you go to the next slide, so the other 3 categories, so we've got project narrative. So how does your project align with our objectives? So objective 1 is around reducing carbon emissions, and objective 2 is around reducing customer detriments. So this is where you can wax lyrical about the benefits that your project is going to have in terms of improving the experience for your customers, or in terms of reducing your carbon emissions. And there's also a section around how you will disseminate information about the project. So how will you engage with your residents to let them know that the project is happening and the benefits that they'll receive? How can you communicate this with other heat networks in your portfolio? How can you communicate this with other organisations within the heat network industry so that learnings can be shared with others as well? So yeah, we're keen to understand within the heat network, within your portfolio, and also within the industry itself. Value for money. So essentially this is quite a cut and dried sort of how much money are you asking for from a grant perspective, and how much carbon are you looking to save, how much gas, how much electricity, and what does that look like in terms of the amount of grant ask that you're asking for. So yeah, like I say, that's very quantitative based on the figures that you've put in. And then finally, the last one is around data availability and baselining. So from a capital perspective, we wouldn't necessarily expect you to have meters at every point on the heat network, but we would expect you to have some and have done some analysis on how your network is currently performing and the type of savings that you can achieve as a result of the funded measures. So we want to understand what meter data do you have available that you can use. So ideally, we ask in the application form whether your baseline and target figures are sort of accurate or estimated. Ideally, we want them to be accurate, but obviously we appreciate that's not always possible. So it is okay to say estimated, but we want to understand what data do you have available to, one, demonstrate that the savings that you've put in your application form are achievable, but also if you were successful, how are you then going to monitor that you are achieving those benefits, so that we can see that the improvements have been made. So we're keen to understand that as well. So those are the 5 criteria. And yeah, so what happens is the assessors will look across all those 5 criteria. They'll give you a score for each one, and then ultimately you get a final score at the end. And then you're basically ranked based on the other applications in that round. And DESNZ will then review all the applications and decide who is eligible for funding or who will be successful for funding. For revenue applications, so there's only 3 criteria for revenue. So obviously we're not looking at network improvements or value for money because you're not actually implementing any improvement measures. So we're just looking at, again, project narrative. How do you align with our objectives, and how are you going to disseminate your information from your revenue study? Cost certainty and delivery certainty again. So have you got any quotes for your optimization study? What's your project plan looking like? Are you going to deliver within the financial years that you've requested funding for? And then data availability and baselining. So for revenue applications, we recognize that actually part of the reason why you might be coming for a revenue application is because you don't have a lot of data. So it's okay to not have data, but we just want to understand what do you have currently. We do ask for a baselining analysis of your network, so we can understand at this stage how poorly is it performing. But again, we appreciate you may not have all the relevant information. So within the capital form, some of the baseline and target figures are mandatory. We do ask that you complete those because you should have that information by the time you're applying for capital. But within revenue applications, there are certain fields we would like you to fill in, but we appreciate that might not be possible. So yeah, it's we want to help people that don't know how their heat network's operating. So yeah, don't be put off if you don't have good levels of data, but just try and fill in as much as you can, even if it's an estimate. We'd much rather have an estimate than nothing. Okay, so next slide then. So in terms of the timescales for round 12, so essentially what happens is you submit your application. We then have an 11-week period, which is essentially our assessors. So Ramboll and Gleeds, from a sort of technical and a cost consultancy perspective, will review your application. We have a number of clarification rounds within that period as well. So if there's something that's not clear in your application, we're able to engage with you and get more clarity on something that's not so obvious. We will then, at the end of that period, submit our assessment outcomes to the HNES Investment Committee. So that's essentially DESNZ colleagues. They will then review the assessments. They may also wish to ask clarifications, so that may either be of the assessor or the applicant itself. So again, there might be further clarifications at that point. And then at the end of that period, they will make a decision on the funding awards. It then needs to go to approvals within DESNZ. So that's with sort of ministers to sign off on the funding. So there's a period at that point of internal approvals. And then by week 20, so hopefully the beginning of October for round 12, we'll be able to confirm to you whether or not you've been successful or unsuccessful with your application. Following that, we will then issue out the grant funding agreements. So that's for non-local authority applicants. So that will follow the week after. But for local authority applicants, we do have to go through additional approvals with MHCLG and the Treasury. So we then need to, once we've got those approvals done, then we can issue out your memorandum of understanding documents. So that takes just a little bit longer than the grant funding agreements, but everyone will receive the outcome of their application at the same time in week 20. It's just the actual funding agreements will follow at different times depending on whether you're a local authority or not. It's worth noting as well that these dates are indicative. Sometimes things slip for various reasons. So if they do slip, we'll try and communicate that to you. But as of now, these are the proposed dates, but potentially there might be some slippage there. It's worth noting when you are submitting your project plans that, as I said before, any work happening before essentially the beginning of October cannot be funded. So when you're putting together your project plans, it's worth having that date in mind, because any work prior to that in your project plan wouldn't be fundable. So please make sure you're considering that time frame when considering the time frames of your project as well. Okay, so as I said, we do have clarifications during this period. So typically during the assessment periods, we raise clarifications in weeks 1, 3, and 5. So it's really useful to make sure that, again, we'll contact the primary and secondary applicant on the application form. So it's important that ideally at least one of those people is around during those weeks so that we can get good responses to the clarifications. And again, at the investment committee stage, there might be further clarifications around week 14. But having said that, we could issue clarifications at any time depending on the level of clarifications required. So it is helpful if both of those two people are going to be away to inform us ahead of time so that we can issue things out to other relevant contacts if possible. So yeah, it's useful to make sure people are available throughout that period to make sure we can answer any clarifications. And obviously that's helpful for you, because if we don't get a response to clarifications in time, we can only assess on what we have in front of us. So the better the clarification responses, the better the assessment. Okay, next slide. So just a couple of things to be aware of if you are successful with your funding. So there are some requirements once you've been awarded funding. One is around monitoring and reporting. So basically this is really important for us because it helps us first to understand how your project is progressing. So are there any issues with your project being delivered to the timeframes that you suggested? Are there any issues with the funding amounts? Is the project suddenly massively over budget or whatever? So we want to understand from both a revenue and a capital perspective things about risks around your project, when you expect to draw down your funding, and an update on your progress. So what have you done in the last month? What are you doing in the next month? Are there any issues? So it's really, really important that we receive these. From a revenue perspective, they're required every month following grant award. So once you've signed your funding agreement, you're required to submit a monitoring and reporting return every month until you have submitted your optimization study into us and we've signed it off. So essentially until your project is finished. And at the end of that, so every month we want to understand about your project progress, any risks and issues, and when you expect to draw down your funding. And then your final return will also include the outputs from your optimization study. So typically your consultant will probably complete that for you, but it just gives a summary of the recommendations that have been made in your study, and it just helps us, because obviously consultants produce reports in different formats. It just helps to provide us a consistent outline of what's being requested so that we can, or what's being recommended, so that we can sort of have a look across all projects in a consistent manner and do some sort of analysis on that. So that will be your final M&R return. For those of you that have been involved in M&R previously, from rounds 10 onwards, we will be using the online portal for M&R returns. So we're holding a separate session, I think, about how to do that. And if you are successful in round 12, we will hold a funded webinars project to talk through more about the requirements for M&R, but they will be submitted through the online portal as well. For capital returns, so again, we want the same M&R returns as you do for revenue projects throughout the time when you are actually installing your measures and up until the point when you have commissioned your measures. So again, we want to understand how is your project progressing, risks and issues, and when you're expecting to draw down the funding. And then on a quarterly basis, we want to understand how you're progressing against your benefits and your KPIs. So obviously in your application form, you will have said we expect to receive or to achieve a particular outcome as a result of our funded measures. We want to understand how close do you get to actually achieving those. So until you've commissioned your project, you need to submit monthly and quarterly returns. And then once you've commissioned your measures, for 24 months after that, so essentially 8 quarters, you'll need to provide your quarterly returns again. And that's basically so that we can see over 2 heating seasons the impact of the measures that have been installed and whether they are, like I say, achieving the targets that were set out at application stage. So yeah, M&R is really important to us and to DESNZ. It helps us to understand that projects are on track. It helps to flag if there are any issues and if any changes need to be made early on in the process. And it also helps us to understand how the projects are delivering against what they requested at application stage. And then in terms of grant claims, so it's just worth noting, if you are a non-local authority, you can only claim your grant funding retrospectively. So what that means is you need to provide evidence to us that you have spent the funding before we can then pay the funding out to you. So we would need to see invoices, for example, from contractors and remittance that you have paid those invoices before we will then issue the grant out to you. So it's just something to be aware of. We need a grant claim form that just aligns basically your funding with what you're claiming, and then we'll also need at the end of the project, or as you're going along, depending on how you want to do it, evidence of the match funding being spent as well. So for capital projects, we need to make sure that at the end of the project, the percentage split is as was in the application form. So if, for example, you front load your grant claim, and then at the end of the project, your project comes in under budget, you would need to pay back some of the grant that you've been awarded already so that the percentage is maintained at the end of the project, because essentially the government can't fund 50% or more than the project. So we just need to make sure that the match funding at the end of the project, everything has been spent as well. For local authorities, it's slightly different. So you are able to claim the funding upfront. So once you've signed your memorandum of understanding, you can submit a grant claim form, and we can then release the funding on a financial year basis. So if you've requested funding over multiple financial years, then we can release the funding for the first financial year. We will then need evidence that you've spent that funding. So again, invoices and remittance, before we can release the second funding for the next financial year, and then the same again if there's a third financial year. So we can't release the funding for a following financial year until we've seen evidence that the funding that's been awarded and issued in the first financial year has been spent. And again, at the end of the project, we'd want to see evidence that you have spent the funding, and if there has been any underspend, then you need to pay back any grant that you've received that wasn't spent. But again, like I say, if you are successful, we will run a dedicated webinar to talk through M&R and grant claims. So this is just for information at this stage, but more information we've provided later. Right, I'm going to hand over to Abigail now to talk through the pre-application support that we offer.
Thanks, Louise. My name's Abigail, and I'll be guiding through some of the information we have on pre-application support. Next slide, please. So we have a team of relationship managers, in case you wanted to reach out if you have any questions about your application or your project. And some of the things we can provide, as you can see in the list of bullet points, we have dedicated one-to-one sessions where you can speak to one of our project managers if you wanted to discuss about your application, which can be corresponded via email. As well as we can help do a first pass review of application that includes feedback, respond to any queries that you may have about your application or your project prior to submission, and as well as signposting to applicants when they are ready to submit. And other than that, we may also require some applicants to speak to one of the relationship managers ahead of submission, as it could be because we want to ensure that the project is sufficiently developed and that the supporting evidence is strong enough to make it worthwhile submitting an application and for us to do the assessment as well. So on both sides, we could save time to ensure that your project is eligible and you're also able to provide sufficient supporting evidence that we may need. And if this is the case, we will reach out to project contacts that we have received from the projects, and we will arrange a session on that. And the email address for this support is hnes.support@talon.com. Next slide, please. So in terms of where you can find help and support, there are several ways you can do this. The first one is our hnes@talon.com email for any general queries that you may have and request to access to our online portal and application pack as well. We would also recommend you to read our HNES guidance for applicants document, as it covers everything that we have covered so far and also further details on the scheme as well. We would also highly recommend that you sign up to our mailing list for latest information and updates about the scheme. An example would be when we host webinars as well. And lastly, you can use the gov.uk website to access optimization guides and optimization guidance videos. These resources are quite useful, especially for those who are starting out on this journey, but also it would include some tips on improvements that may not need funding, as well as information on general improvements and maintenance. This leads to the end on pre-application support, and I'll pass back onto the team. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Abby. We're now going to enter the Q&A section of the session. So I can see there's quite a few questions in the chat. And
do you want me to touch on one around the sort of customers in need, because I think quite a lot of them are based on that, which is obviously to be expected. So I'm going to pick up on Anna's comment, because I think it's the only one I haven't actually responded to yet. But so the question is, if we have, for example, a number of customers on the priority services register as financially vulnerable, will that count towards the eligibility criteria of customers in need, and what should be the ratio? For example, if we have 10 customers vulnerable out of a 250 unit scheme. So I guess that plays towards the evidence that we ask. So if you're able to demonstrate that there are a certain number, like I say, of, for example, flagged on the PSR as financially vulnerable, that is evidence that you have financially vulnerable residents. What we do look at, we do look at the whole development as well, though. So and try to understand the additionality of the HNES funding. So obviously the funding is there, it's government funding. We want to support those developments that would not be able to undertake this work themselves without government support. So if they don't get HNES funding, essentially the project doesn't go ahead. So what we do look at is the development in the round. And if, for example, you had 10 vulnerable customers out of 250, we would be looking at those 240 other residents and sort of trying to understand, okay, well, what's their barrier to being able to pay for it themselves, aside from obviously everyone wants to not have to pay as much as they might have to if there's government funding there. But ideally, we want to prioritise our funding to those that really can't afford to do this themselves. So that would be one of the questions that we would ask. So we do say that Again, those that have higher percentages of customers in need will be prioritised for that reason. What we don't want is a block of sort of luxury apartments where they've got, I don't know, like I say in this case, sort of a very small proportion of vulnerable customers. And what we're looking at is actually these residents could probably afford to do this themselves. What is this additionality around the HNES funding? Why would this project not go ahead without HNES funding particularly? And that applies to revenue studies as well. So with revenue studies, obviously this eligibility criteria isn't there. But again, we're looking at studies between £15,000 and £24,000, and depending on the size of the development, if you're looking to spread those costs across all residents, the question would be why can't these residents fund this themselves? Why do they need government funding for this to happen? So we obviously only have a limited pot of money. We want to make sure it's going to the most vulnerable people, and we're helping those who really can't afford to pay their bills anyway, and then they're on an inefficient heat network, so they're having to pay more than they should have to do anyway. Those are the kind of people we mainly want to help. So that's the reason for bringing in that that sort of entry, that eligibility level. So it is worth considering when you are submitting either a capital or a revenue project, that's the kind of mindset and the sort of backdrop to what we're looking to fund. So as Abby's just said, we do have relationship managers. For capital projects, we will ask you to speak with one of our relationship managers ahead of submission, just so that we can make sure that you are eligible, and we're not then wasting your time and our time by receiving ineligible applications. But also from a revenue perspective, we will ask for the number of customers in need as well, just to make sure that we are aligning the receiving projects that align with our objectives as well. So hopefully that's clear. I appreciate that there's sort of, it is a new criteria from previous rounds, but yeah, there isn't a minimum figure for customer need particularly, but we do look at it in the round, and we do look at the type of developments that are being submitted to us, and we do consider whether or not we think the funding, the project wouldn't go ahead without HNES funding.
I think we've had another question come through from Finian. He asked, will the index of multiple deprivation of the site location also be considered when assessing applications alongside the percentage of customers in need?
It's not something I've come across before. I'm not an assessor, so I don't know if that's something the assessors have been looking at. Again, it depends on the level of evidence. So we have had applications in the past where they've basically said, typically in this region, we would expect to see a level of deprivation of, I don't know, 5%, something like that, and therefore we can infer that this development has the same. That's not as strong as, here is the list of the number of people that are on our priority service register for being financially vulnerable, for example. So we want to see as much evidence as possible of the specifics of that network. What evidence do you have of financially vulnerable customers on that network, not an inferred, typically in this region it's around this, therefore we would expect a certain number of applicants of residents to be in that same category. It's just not as strong evidence. So we are keen to understand the specifics about a specific network rather than necessarily a region particularly. I hope that answers the question.
Yes. Conscious that there was a lot of chatter in the chat, so if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to pop your hand up, or any points of your question you feel we didn't answer, and yeah, feel free to turn your camera on and ask away.
Yeah, I think I answered most of
I think you've covered
questions, but I think there were some people that then since come back to my comments that I haven't seen.
Yeah.
May have grown and developed careers, etc., and income. Okay, so there was a question around social housing and whether or not people are then eligible if they've been in the social housing development for a long time. Obviously, we appreciate that you don't have financial income of all your residents and you wouldn't necessarily want to share it with us anyway if you did. So if it's a social housing block where when they came into their tenancies, they were required to have a certain financial or meet certain financial criteria, then that would be sufficient. We're not going to ask, if they've been in there 20 years, do they still now meet that? If that was the requirement for them to get in the first place, then that's sufficient for us to class that as customers in need. There's another question about the index of multiple deprivation. So I think that's been answered. And then with regards to, so there was a question around where the match funding could come from and whether it could come from other government sources. One of the sources was a Welsh fund. So we've had this before, and my understanding is that it still wouldn't be covered even though it's coming from Welsh government. I think it comes down to ultimately, although it's devolved from the UK government, does it ultimately come from Treasury or not? And I think basically the decision was that even if it's a Welsh government fund only, it still couldn't be used because it's still coming from essentially government. Match funding needs to come from other sources. So it doesn't necessarily have to be. So for example, in some cases it's leaseholders. So people have to go through Section 20 processes to make sure that they've got the leaseholder funding. So it doesn't necessarily have to be from the organisation that's applying per se, because it could be through leaseholders. In that case, we would want to understand that leaseholders are aware that they are being asked to contribute, or they will be asked to contribute if they're successful before the application is submitted. So we do have projects where they find out that they've been successful and then run the Section 20 process afterwards. That's okay, but what we want to make sure is that residents have already been informed that this Section 20 process is coming and they are likely to be required to pay however much before you submit the application, because what we don't want is the application to be submitted, the funding awarded, and then for whatever reason it can't get over the Section 20 process and the project falls over and then doesn't go ahead. So it's things like that you just need to consider when you're looking at your match funding. I can see there's a hand up. I think, is it Finian?
Yeah.
Hi, Louise. Hi.
Hi.
I mean, this isn't so much as a question, but I suppose there's not many kind of forums that you get to kind of make this point, I suppose. But I've already asked you a question about private residents and funding going forwards for those, and I suppose there's a lot of emphasis obviously around customers in need, etc. But one could also make the point that a lot of private residents are also equally trapped on developments that they bought a property, they didn't understand what a heat network was. There has been a complete lack of regulation and etc. and all the problems that we know about. So you could equally say that on paper somebody might have a job, etc. and live on a heat network, but actually they're in a very difficult situation because the heat network is does need work. Would you look at kind of, if we can make a case around particular sites, would you consider those?
I don't think so. I think it is a sort of a black and white line. If it doesn't meet our definition of customers in need, unless it has that strategic importance criteria, then essentially no. That's the policy position as we've been informed. So that's the eligibility criteria from DESNZ. And so unless you can demonstrate, we're not saying it has to be social housing, for example,
Yeah,
if there
no, I
is
get that.
evidence that you have where
No,
you can
I
see that
suppose,
people are financially vulnerable, then we
I
can
suppose that's,
consider it. But otherwise,
I suppose what I'm saying is, and it's a wider point, and you know, it's probably maybe not even something you can comment on, but you know, one could argue that social housing organisations got typically their gilt edge. They're very strong balance sheet. They've got very cheap access to debt. You know, we're working with schemes where developers gone, there's nobody there. You just got a group of residents really that have got nowhere to go really, and don't have a balance sheet even necessarily. Don't even have a legal entity. Yeah.
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 I personally can't talk to it because it's
No.
a
Okay.
a sort of government policy
Maybe
view.
in
I
a
mean,
conversation. Yeah.
I
Go
would
on.
suggest picking it up with DESNZ if that's
Yeah.
something. Obviously, it's a policy change which we're sort of obviously implementing. But I'm sure DESNZ would be interested to hear feedback from the industry as to the impact of this change. And if you've got any thoughts or comments on that, then feel free to reach out to them and feed that back, I think.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Just conscious of time, I think we've got one more question in the chat.
Yeah. So is that one from David Jones?
Yes.
Okay, I'll and I've just seen another one come in I think we might not have time for.
Okay.
But yeah, the one around the leaseholders have 5 years to pay for any works we undertake. So would that impact our requirement to demonstrate payment of our match funding in the financial year? So we can allow for grant funding to be used upfront and match funding to use subsequently. But we are also obviously keen to support projects that can deliver as quickly as possible so that the benefits can be realised as quickly as possible. If your project's going to take 5 years to deliver, then that might be a bit trickier in terms of sort of assessing the impact and the benefits of the project. So I think maybe for that one we might need to have a discussion offline, David, about how best to evidence that and what that would mean in terms of the length of time for your project to be delivered, because that does kind of, I mean, that essentially goes past the end of the HNES scheme, let alone in terms of the funding that we have available. So yeah, maybe that's something we can take offline and talk through separately, I think.
Great. Well, I'd like to say thank you all for coming. We hope you found the session useful. And as mentioned, we will be sharing our slides and the recording with you afterwards. So thank you for your time. If you'd like to follow our social pages, you can see both our LinkedIn and our Twitter there. And you can also join our mailing list at hnes@talon.com. So thank you all for joining.
And Susanna, I'm just messaging you.